Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We are in Georgia now, and this is part of the broadcast we're doing from the Good News Network. That's gnnradio.org. And yesterday we were in South Carolina, today in Georgia, in Augusta, Georgia, and looking forward to a great conversation today on our Friday edition here of Point of View. We're going to be talking about a number of different issues. In just a minute, we'll be talking with our good friend, Dr. Merrill Matthews, who's in Dallas. We'll also talk about some of the reasons why so many people are concerned about Anthony Fauci, some questions about the way in which we are drawing districts for the congressional races in the future, whether or not we're going to add more Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court, all sorts of issues we're going to be talking about today. But I thought it would be good, since we're at the Good News Network, to actually spend just a moment or two talking with Clarence Baranowski, president of the Georgia Carolina Tower Company, but more importantly, head of the Good News Network. And Clarence, this is not the first time I've been here, but again, thank you for your gracious hospitality here in Georgia.
Well, we appreciate you coming. Great to see you again.
Can you briefly, for some of our listeners all over the country that maybe aren't familiar with Good News Network, although we mention their names sometimes when we have a caller, how this started? Because as I understand, you were putting up various radio towers and then came to the conclusion that this would eventually be a radio network.
Well, just the opposite. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? But I was traveling for a living selling feed, and I wanted to hear Christian radio. And there was an AM station here in town, but by the time you got 40, 50 miles out of town, you couldn't hear it. At that time, Ronald Reagan came into office. He deregulated a lot of things and made it possible for somebody like me who majored in agriculture, and I can tell you how to raise chickens, but I couldn't tell you the slightest thing about how to run a radio station. But we wanted to do it, and so the Lord provided the opportunity for us to get into the radio business. And we started here in Augusta with WLPE, and we woke up one morning and said, WLPE, we love Polish evangelists. No, that wasn't what it really came to mind, but we love people everywhere.
Yes.
And then we have grown to where we are over 20 outlets right now. Kirby, and again, this is not based on my gift and talent, because I hardly knew AM from FM, but here we are today, and we are covering quite a bit of area in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and then we get mail from people all over the United States who listen online.
And again, we will mention that people can go to gnnradio.org and find out a little bit more if they're traveling in the Southeast. And in just a few minutes, we're going to talk with Dr. Merrill Matthews. But one of the things I've been saying so often is that Georgia has really been in the news a lot lately. And so in some respects, even though we broadcast all over the country, we keep talking about your state that you live in right now.
Well, we are known for creating situations that require news, but this case, I think it's a case of, you just wonder if people aren't ignorant or what it is to treat the state of Georgia like they did, but we don't want to delve into that too much. But we're grateful, so grateful, Kirby, to have your program on, and there's some people who turn the news off, saying they get enough from Kirby Anderson's program. And we appreciate your efforts and what you do. Glad you considered us to come and visit with us, and we're so grateful for the ministry that you provide to both of you, and we are grateful.
Well, and if nothing else, thank you for your hospitality. As I've said before, I eat all this good barbecue. If I fall asleep during the show, somebody wake me up, because it has been very good. And you've been so gracious, and thank you for your hospitality. So again, Clarence has been with us, and let me, if I can, connect up real quickly to Dallas, Texas, and that is Dr. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation is in the studio. And Dr. Matthews, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Kirby. I'm here with the crew.
Yeah, and so we're doing it remotely, and you're in the studio. One of the articles we've posted is actually by one of your colleagues, Tom Giovanetti, on inflation. But I might also mention that I think it connects up very well to something that you've written about, and that is the argument that you make that some of the states, and you use Texas as one example, should opt out of the $300 per week federal unemployment benefits, because that's in addition to the state's regular unemployment. And if you look at my commentary yesterday, I pointed out the fact that the biggest problem we have is when you're paying people more to stay home, then a lot of people don't go out and work. And so your argument is that it's grateful that some of these governors are doing that, but your question is, what took so long?
Right. There's two big news items in regard to that this week, and one is that so many states have decided to end the $300 a week federal unemployment benefit, which is in addition to the state's unemployment benefit. So typically, unemployment benefits is a state function. States provide that. The federal government last year provided for much of the year a $600 additional per week benefit, which put people, since the average state unemployment rate runs $300 to $400 a week, that put an awful lot of people at around $1,000 a week. That helped them a lot. That ended, and so they passed another one, and now it's $300 a week. In addition to the state unemployment rate. So that puts you at around $600 to $700 a week. And the Bank of America recently came out and said if you were making $31,000 to $32,000 a year, you're probably better off on the unemployment benefit roll than you are in the going back to work. And that's one of the reasons why I think many of us think that a number of people are staying out of the workforce. And interestingly now, 22 states have decided to end that unemployment benefit, that a federal unemployment benefit, and they're doing it over in either June or July. Every one of those states are led by Republicans with Republican legislatures. So it's very interesting to see how Republicans have decided to push back on the federal, the additional federal role. And interestingly, yesterday or day before yesterday, the administration came out and said, we'd really like to stop the states from doing that, but we're not sure we can because they have a certain amount of freedom under our federalist system.
Yes, again, like you point out, more than 20 states, and again, all tend to be red states. What's happening in the blue states? And I've said before, and we maybe can talk about this after the break, that one of the issues that you're starting to see people say is, well, you're implying that people are lazy. Okay, I'll not deny that there are probably some lazy people out there. But seriously, if you have to be making $35,000 a year or more to even justify walking outside your house and then deal with some of the difficulties out there, or even the possibility that many people faced a while back of COVID-19, you can see why people use rational choices. And in this particular case, not only do the individuals make those choices, but now some of those governors are making those choices as well. Let's take a break, and we will come back, and you will find a number of articles we've posted today on the website, which is pointofview.net. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to get into all sorts of topics, and we'll have some of the conversation with Dr. Merrill Matthews. But most importantly, as we did yesterday from South Carolina, even though we are broadcasting live, in this case from Georgia, we can take your phone calls. So we'd love to get your thoughts, and maybe you already have a thought about whether or not it makes sense to pay people not to work. I think you've got some thoughts about that. Of course, the phone call is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
3 scientific discoveries point to the existence of God. Dr. Stephen Meyer makes that claim in his book, Return of the God Hypothesis. A week ago, he was on my radio program to make the case for God. Arguments for the existence of God were compelling, but began to be challenged in the 19th century. For example, we had Darwin telling us where we came from. Marx, with a secular eschatology, was telling us where we were going, and Freud had an account of what to do with the human condition. By the end of the 19th century, you had this materialistic worldview that answered all the basic basic questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always answered. Meyer explains that there have been major cosmological and biological discoveries in the 20th century that are bringing back the features of the God hypothesis. The first significant discovery is that the physical universe had a beginning. Scientific materialists assumed that the material universe was eternal and thus self-existent. But now, most accept the fact that the universe began with an initial Big Bang. Second, physicists have discovered that we live in a Goldilocks universe. Scientists are finding fundamental physical laws and parameters of our universe that have been finely tuned against all odds to make our universe capable of hosting life. Third, discoveries in molecular biology have revealed the presence of a digital code at the foundation of life. This suggests a master programmer behind the genetic structure of DNA. The book also devotes an entire section to conjectures and refutations. Is there a rational response to the idea proposed by skeptics of multiple universes? What about Stephen Hawking and quantum cosmology? The God hypothesis is back in large part because of the remarkable advances in science in the last century. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, broadcasting today from Augusta, Georgia on the Good News Network. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us for a while. And even before we get to our next article, I thought, Dr. Matthews, since we already have phone calls coming in, if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. So let's go to the Good News Network in Georgia. Donna, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Thank you for taking my call. I listen to 102.7 all the time. I love the station out of Abilene, Georgia, WPMA, Good News Network. But I would like to respond to two different things. One, our governor disappointed us right after the election. I voted for him. Governor Kemp, I really love Governor Kemp, but he disappointed me early on. However, the last few months, he has been, or a couple, 3 months, he has been signing some great bills for the state of Georgia. Great bills. I'm so happy to live in this state. And I think he's redeemed himself. Secondly, no, I do not think that people should earn money for not working. Stop the stimulus, get people back to work. Everywhere I go, there are hiring signs. Businesses are actually closing again because they cannot find anyone to work.
Well, you know, Dr. Merrill Matthews, one of the things we talked about is that, according to Senator Ben Sasse, we have millions of job openings, and in April, only 266,000 new jobs. And that may sound like a lot, but they were expecting there would be 1 million new jobs created and only 266,000. So obviously you're looking at some of the same numbers that, Evan, we are hearing about right here from one of the listeners here in Georgia.
That's right. It's been interesting to see what happened there because they expected, as you say, nearly 1 million new jobs in April. Didn't happen. It was much lower than they thought. And part of this, I think, there are people who who are concerned about going back because of COVID is still out there and so forth, even though the cases are declining significantly. But there are economic incentives for people to stay home. And starting, I think, in July, you're going to have the additional child benefit. That's a significant child benefit that will provide even more funding for people. And then, we talked about the amount of money that you can make given the unemployment benefits and both state and federal. But in addition to that, you can sign up for Obamacare, and if you're a lower income person, you don't have employer-based health insurance, you're not on Medicare or Medicaid, you sign up for Obamacare. Taxpayers will will provide a subsidy for that, so you can get health insurance that's worth in the neighborhood of probably $10,000, $8,000 to $10,000 a year, maybe more. So you add it all together, and there's a financial incentive not to go back to work. And as you point out, people make rational decisions for the most part based upon their economic interests. That's not something that's bad. I'm not criticizing people for doing it, but if you're not in a career track position, you're not really looking to be to move up a career line in this company or that company or the other company, and so you're just working to try to make bills, make payments, and make ends meet. It may be a better decision for you economically to stay home. And that's why 35 states, in addition to roughly 22 states having said we're not going to provide these additional benefits, I think 35 states have said they decided during the pandemic to say, we're not going to require you to go out and look for a job because there weren't jobs out there if you're on unemployment benefits. Most of the states are now pulling that back, including Florida, and saying, no, you're going to have to go out and look for a job, actively look for a job if you're going to get unemployment benefits. So they're trying to get the incentives back and get them right again because, Kirby, we need workers. I mean, Donna is absolutely right. Here in Texas, almost every place I go into has a ad wanted sign. We help wanted. We want people here to come and work.
Again, if you were wanting to write something down or put this in your Facebook or let your member of Congress know, according to Senator Ben Sass from Nebraska, he said he thinks this is a clear policy failure, that there were 7.4 million job openings, according to his numbers, and yet fewer than 300,000 people actually decided to find work in April. Senator Tim Scott, we were in South Carolina yesterday, he said Democrats are disincentivizing work, pushing billions in wasteful spending and threatening major job hikes, which brings me to an article written by one of your colleagues, Tom Giovannetti. Mm-hmm. Inflation is the most miserable tax of all. Right. Now, for our older listeners here, you remember the misery index. Okay, you millennials and Gen Z, you've never heard this before, but the misery index was created in which you would talk about the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And now, because we have, I think, a rise in inflation, which I think is actually higher than is even admitted to by the government, and we have this unemployment rate, we have a misery index that is about the highest it's ever been. What did you find? Well,
Tom Giovannetti wrote this, and people can go and find it at IPI.org. And the title of it is Inflation is the Most Miserable Index of All, most miserable tax of all. And he's saying that inflation is essentially a tax because it takes our money away. It devalues our dollars. But the misery index was created in the 1960s. As you point out, older people will remember, and I do, Jimmy Carter brought this up, and I believe it was against Gerald Ford, highlighting the misery index there. But then once Jimmy Carter came into office, inflation exploded under him, and the unemployment rate was still fairly high. You put those two together, and it was significantly, it was very high. Tom, in fact, points out by 1980, that was the year that Ronald Reagan was elected at the end of that year, but the misery index all-time high was 21.98% in June of 1980. 21.98%. Kirby, I remember people in the late 70s boasting to me that they were going to buy a house and they were able to get a interest rate on their mortgage of 15%, and they thought that was a great interest rate. Now it's in the neighborhood of 2 or 3%, and you just can't imagine how long it takes to pay off a house and how high your payments are if you're up there at 15% for an interest rate.
Let me just mention, too, we've also posted, it's a third article there on our website, pointofview.net, and look at this comparison. the misery index was at an all-time low September of 2019. That was when, what was his name? Donald Trump was president. The lowest misery index in the history of our country since it was invented in the 1960s. Of course, the highest under Jimmy Carter. And now the misery index is not 5%, it's 21%. So in some respects, Dr. Merle Matthews, a few people said this sort of feels like Jimmy Carter too, with the issue of unemployment and inflation. Let's take another phone call because we do have a lot of people calling in. Maybe you have some thoughts about this issue. Dr. Merle Matthews with us. We're broadcasting today, of course, from the Good News Network headquarters in Augusta, Georgia. And we'll go, in this particular case, to Illinois. And Joy, thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
Go ahead.
I sympathize and I understand the economic impact of all of this, but I'm not hearing much conversation about the impact on personal integrity and personal, I forgot the word I want to use now, but the individual
responsibility,
itself,
maybe?
Pardon?
Responsibility?
Responsibility, self-esteem,
No,
all sorts. Yeah.
Self-esteem. Yes, thank you. Self-esteem. When you continually take and take and take and take, it does something to you. There is no good feeling of work accomplished.
And of course, if nothing else, we certainly see in the book of Genesis that we were made to do work, and there is value to work, and there is self-esteem, and there's accomplishment. And of course, Dr. Merle Matthews is talking about responsibility. When you start talking about universal basic income, which was proposed by Andrew Yang, who's of course now running for mayor in New York City, and giving people handouts. Of course, we've been doing this through the pandemic. I think that does have a real significant impact on individuals. So in addition to what is happening in terms of inflation and all of the rest, there's just the very corrosive aspect of giving people something for nothing.
Kirby, I can't tell you, back in the mid-'90s when the country was going through welfare reform and they passed a number of bills at the state level, and then they finally passed one in 96 at congressional level, I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said, I had been on welfare for years and this required me to go back to work, and I did. I never thought I could go back to work, and now I'm making a job, I'm making an income, I have more self-esteem, and my kids are proud of me because I'm actually on a career track.
Well, incredible. So again, if you'd like to join us, we've taken a couple of phone calls today, but if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more, this article on inflation comes from our good friends at the Institute for Policy Innovation, so you can go to ipi.org. You'll find certainly this article and the one by Dr. Merle Matthews. We're going to keep him on until after the break because he's got another article that relates as well to some of the things that we've been talking about happening here in Georgia and some of the remaining counties around here. So we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Broadcasting today from Augusta, Georgia on the Good News Network. And thank you again for those of you listening all over the country. And if you'd like to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Also have Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us at least for the first hour, and wanted to maybe now focus on something else, because Dr. Merrill Matthews, as I've said before to some of the younger listeners, and I might as a program note mention that we'll have our Millennial Roundtable on Monday, they did not live through, of course, hyperinflation and a misery index that was off the charts, nor did they live through actually long gas lines. But since I'm broadcasting today from Georgia and yesterday broadcasting from South Carolina, when the Colonial Pipeline was hacked by this Eastern European group, Darkside, all of a sudden we saw those long lines that many of us may have experienced in the 1970s. And another article that people can find at ipi.org. And again, you got to love the humor of Dr. Merrill Matthews. What is the difference between the Colonial Pipeline and what Joe Biden has been wanting to do? About 15 years. And so whether we're talking about the Colonial Pipeline or the Keystone XL pipeline, or in a minute we'll talk about one involving Russia, this is, I think, a reminder of what indeed it would be like with the Green New Deal, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Darkside shut down the Colonial Pipeline, wanting to get $5 million. Joe Biden also wants to shut down the Colonial Pipeline and every other pipeline, just not immediately, probably after the next election, presidential election. But yes, he wants to move away from fossil fuels to green energy, renewable energy, primarily wind and solar power. And so one of the things he did on his first day in office is he essentially canceled the Keystone XL pipeline that had been a political football for a decade. Donald Trump allowed that to move forward. The Obama administration was initially going to allow it to move forward, then decided not to let it move forward, and then Trump came back and let it move forward. So yes, Joe Biden essentially wants to end these pipelines and the fossil fuels that are there, but he also knew that if he was taking the blame for this, his administration, if he wasn't helped trying to get the Colonial Pipeline back up and running, because it affected so many people so quickly. And one thing that politicians don't want to see is long gas lines and high prices at the pump. And you got both of them immediately with that. Ironically, Kirby, Donald Trump was put pressure upon Germany for going forward with the Nord Stream pipeline that was coming, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline coming in from Germany, from Russia, and yet Joe Biden has sort of given up on that. It seems the Russians are not going to be nearly as concerned about clean energy, about carbon dioxide waste and other things coming from their pipeline operations, and yet Joe Biden has largely given up on that and allowing Germany to go forward, even though Donald Trump fought that.
Well, and again, I think that is a good illustration of the fact that if indeed you are concerned about the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, and that's the argument of the Green New Deal, or what you a little bit later in the article talk about in terms of the so-called infrastructure bill, that is certainly one issue that would cause you to say, well, if you're concerned about carbon coming from the United States, you should be concerned about carbon coming into the atmosphere from Germany, Russia, China, something else.
Yes.
Yeah, and so, again, it's something that you've been talking about for some time in terms of the fact that if you really look at the details of the Green New Deal, elements of it are in the infrastructure bill, aren't they?
Absolutely. They've got a number of things in there in the infrastructure, including the expansion of electric cars, building charging stations around the country, the effort to move further towards wind and solar power. So they're pumping a lot of money in that to try to create, and not fix the infrastructure, but create a new infrastructure that lays transmission lines from areas in the country where you put the wind turbines so that you get those into the cities and so forth. So he puts a lot of money in there, even as he wants to try to take away what he says as the tax breaks of the fossil fuel companies. I've argued in several places that they really don't get, that they do get a few tax breaks, but those are tax breaks that are available to virtually every industry that's involved in manufacturing and other things of that nature. So that's one of the key elements of the Green New Deal and of his infrastructure bill, and Republicans apparently are not going to go along with that.
I would think so. Let's, if we can, take some more phone calls. I see that Tyler wants to talk about some of these tax breaks that have been given to corporations and things of that nature. So we'll go to the state of Arizona. And Tyler, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yes. So my question was more along the lines of inflation. So we hear about inflation going up over the last few months within the Biden administration. However, what has really happened that really could have affected that within this administration? We've given billions, trillions of dollars away to corporations with stimulus packages and whatnot, whereas I hear the first one that went to the American public, everyone's like, oh, inflation. All of a sudden, now it's a part of the conversation. To me, that doesn't add up. So what would be, how has this administration affected this so thoroughly that it's now on everyone's minds? You don't hear about it when we talk about giving corporations stimulus packages or signing the defense budget. And those were significantly more than this latest round of stimulus packages to the American people. Is this all just a fear tactic? I'm serious. Like, what's going on here?
I think you go ahead.
I was going to say it's a good question that Tyler has. There was bipartisan support for both the stimulus package or the rescue package from March of last year, and then there was bipartisan support for the one that was passed in December of this past year. Where the concern is coming in is that the Biden's most recent package that he got passed in February, and now we've got two more out there, the American Rescue Plan, others that are on the table, and now you're talking about spending, in years past. Remember, Kirby, back in February 2009, when Barack Obama pushed through his stimulus package of about $800 billion, that was considered just to be a massive bill.
That was seen as draconian, wasn't it, at the time? And that's small change now, isn't it?
And now we're talking about trillions, but it's not just, to Tyler's point, it's not just the money that the federal government is appropriating to spend on things. It is also the Federal Reserve Bank, which has been buying up bonds and other things and inflating and putting out a lot of money out there, and it has not seen the reason so far to really scale that back. In fact, the minutes that just got released, was it 2 days ago, I guess, on Wednesday, and they looked at that, and the Fed started saying, we may have to begin thinking about scaling that back sometime in the near future, but not for maybe a year or two. It sent the stock market into a tizzy, but they've just been dramatically pumping money into the economy in various ways that the Fed is allowed to do. And what you'd expect is inflation has been relatively flat for a decade now. You have to go back to 2011 to find it when an annual inflation rate was a little over, just a tad over 3%, but it's been in the 1% to 2% range now, or sometimes even a little lower for a decade, and it's going to come back. And part of that may be temporary. That's from the shortages and so forth that we have right now, but I suspect a fair amount of it may be permanent.
Well, let me again I know Tyler's asking a very good question, and one of the things I suggested in a commentary I wrote a few days ago is get on your computer and use Google or Bing or whatever. Just type in M2 money stock. What you will find is, first of all, it shows the amount of money that's been printed. And really, since about 2008, when we had the shock that you talked about, the amount of money being printed goes up a little bit. But then when you get to 2020, it just shoots straight vertically. And you'll notice, first of all, that the amount of money being printed within the last year, and some of that is under Trump, and some of it is under Biden. So it's both of those individuals. It shoots straight up. The second thing you'll notice when you go there is the a notice that says the words discontinued. And that's because the Federal Reserve used to give you a weekly chart, but now we're printing money so fast, they've given up trying to even keep up with the amount of money being printed every week. And so now you can get one that's a monthly update. But Tyler, if you look at that, if inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods, then certainly part of inflation, most of it is due to what's called monetary inflation. And I think some of it is also due to the disruption in the supply chain. If you go out and buy wood right now at Home Depot or Lowe's, you're going to know that you're paying a whole lot more for wood. I think that has as much to do with the supply chain disruption as anything else. But most of this inflation is due to under Trump during the pandemic and now under Biden, you have had just an incredible amount, almost 35% of all the dollars in the world were created within the last 12 to 13 months. That's called inflation. We'll take a break, take some more phone calls right after this.
In a study of 10th and 12th graders conducted during peak COVID-19 school lockdown months, fewer respondents reported feeling depressed than in a study conducted 2 years earlier. The study's lead author, academic psychologist Jean Twenge, says spending more time with their families was good for these teenagers' mental health. The baseline for Gen Z happiness is low. Their extensive social media use and often minimal in-person social interaction makes healthy family life crucial for them. Yet there are powerful societal forces threatening to mitigate the influence of the nuclear family. Countless studies and simple common sense tell us that a child fares best when raised by a married mom and dad. Even organizations one could describe as woke admit that kids with married parents do best. To them, the nuclear family is an oppressor precisely because it provides these good outcomes. The Colson Center's John Stonestreet and Maria Baer point to Black Lives Matter's prior statements of their intention to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement. Mr. Stonestreet's Breakpoint commentary identifies scholars who acknowledge the benefits but maintain that nuclear families disadvantage other family arrangements, an example of privilege rooted in white supremacy. In a recent sermon, Pastor John MacArthur told the congregation at Grace Community Church and his radio audience, this culture is weaponized to destroy children. It's systematically designed to do that. He lamented the millions of babies slaughtered in the womb. He then critiqued public education, where children come under the influence of those whose agenda is anti-God, anti-Christ, and anti-Scripture. Politicians, he said, are making laws that are devastating to children under the pressure of sexual freedom, homosexuality, transgenderism, and banning hate speech to punish people who speak against these things. The current universal government daycare proposal, with its stated goal to get mothers into the workforce, is not a solution to the weakening of the American family. We must summon the courage to uphold God's good design for the family. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, broadcasting from Augusta, Georgia, on the Good News Network. And again, we welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us for just a few more minutes. And so far, we've had your hat on as the energy expert. I thought I'd put your hat on for just a minute, which we best known you for healthcare policy. Mm-hmm. And the first article that we've put out, Dr. Matthews is about Dr. Fauci. And Kyle Smith says, when you think about the fact that Anthony Fauci is just the head of one of 27 agencies under the National Institutes of Health, which is in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, it's amazing that he's had the kind of national figure that he is. But then goes on to point out that the approval rate for Anthony Fauci is now down to 7% among the Republicans. And just to put that in perspective, 13 months ago, in April of 2020, about 65% of Democrats gave him a very strong approval rating, 61% of Republicans. And that number has dropped precipitously for Republicans and for others too, but we'll leave it at that. And the point is that they, in this article, which it goes on for pages, so I really encourage people to read it, reminds us of the number of times where Dr. Anthony Fauci, by his own admission, lied, whether it's about masks, whether it is what we would need to finally get to something like herd immunity, whether or not he was engaged in theater when he was challenged by U.S. Senator Rand Paul. And so this article just goes on to remind us of why it is that so many people do not trust an individual who is the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. You're a healthcare expert. What's your thoughts?
Well, the article you're referring to is by Kyle Smith at National Review, and it's just an excellent article in summing up so many of the points that I think a lot of us have been concerned about. He points out about the mask issue initially when we first started entering the pandemic, and they were commentators, including Dr. Fauci and others, Surgeon General at the time, all sort of discouraged people from wearing masks, and not just discouraging. We sort of say you don't need to wear the mask. It would be foolish for you to wear the mask if you're in the United States. I was at a meeting. I had to speak at a meeting with a county health official on March 12th of last year, and the question came up, well, should we wear a mask, because they had not been really widely used at the time and they'd been discouraged. And he said, well, unless you have one of the N95 masks and you have it especially fitted for your face, it's not going to help you, and it's not going to help others. And we went from that, Kirby, to not only just not you need to wear an N95 mask, but wear anything over your face at all, and maybe two handkerchiefs if that's all you have. It's just amazing what has happened among the CDC, and I'm working on a piece right now that I'm calling the CDC's incredibly shrinking credibility, because Dr. Walensky came out, was it earlier this week or last week, and said, well, we sort of changed our mind now, and you can go out, and if you've been vaccinated, you don't need to wear the mask. You can be outside. You don't need to wear the mask. And that was, she said that was just a change from all the information and data coming in just the last 2 weeks. What I think actually came in was a call from the White House saying, you need to get on board with this, because we're out here trying to say get vaccinated and other things, and people are saying, why do I need to get vaccinated if I still have to wear a mask, and what's the purpose in it? The mixed messages have been so rampant. And the amazing thing is, Democrats have used this to say, we have to follow the science, and the science has flipped, including Dr. Fauci, so many times. It looks like a fish out of water. They've just flipped so many times.
Well, and again, you mentioned one of the other examples there, of course, is the idea of whether or not you should wear a mask if you've already been vaccinated. And, of course, Rand Paul was accusing him of theater. And then just the other day on Good Morning America, you kind of have the comment being made, well, maybe after all, he didn't say that Rand Paul was right, but he kind of gave the acknowledgement that he knew that the CDC guideline of requiring masking for vaccinated people was wrong, but didn't say that. And then back to the one that I mentioned just a minute ago, during Christmas Eve story, which I think is so interesting in the New York Times. First it was, what's herd immunity? Well, right. Maybe it's 60%. Then, maybe it's 70%. Then maybe it's 80%. Then maybe it's 90%. And finally, as he did with the mask, and admit that I just did this because I didn't want people buying masks, he said, well, I just sort of was taking the pulse of the American people. And when polls said that only about half Americans were going to take the vaccine. That's when I said herd immunity was at 70 to 75%. But then when we saw a higher percentage, maybe 60% were going to take the vaccine, then I ran up to 80%. So you can see this is just after a while where you just have to shake your head. And yet this is an individual that is given more prominence than almost anybody else in the area of NIH and HHS, don't you think?
I saw that, and I just felt like, do you have help putting your foot in your mouth, or do you do it all on your own? Because I could have actually bailed him out easier than that. I could have said, had I been him, well, look, we've got these new variants out there. These new variants may be more contagious than some of the others. They appear to be, and so yes, we thought initially it would be 60 to 70%, but as we see these new variants coming in, they are more contagious. It probably needs to be more like 70 to 80%, maybe 85%. Measles is actually up around 90 or 95% in order to get herd immunity. He could have addressed it that way, but he didn't. He just, it's amazing to me, Kirby, and I just think so many people have lost their sense of credibility with the CDC that I don't really care what they say anymore, because I don't really believe you. You've changed so much, and you've disavowed things that you said initially that I'm not. And you've got the Democrats and the teachers weighing in and having their input. It's just not clear that it's trustworthy anymore.
Well, again, when we come back in the next hour, we'll get into some other issues. We'll talk about the ceasefire in Israel. What does that mean? We'll talk about a couple of other issues related to what's called gerrymandering, or drawing various congressional districts. But just before I thought I'd let you go, Dr. Merrill Matthews, there's something else, and that is that remember a number of months ago when the argument was that there isn't any evidence at all that the COVID-19 virus originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And as a matter of fact, when Tucker Carlson, I know, did an interview with one of these individuals who had a pretty good evidence and arguments for the fact that it may have come from the Institute, it was labeled as a conspiracy theory. But now I'm noticing that PolitiFact the other day had to backtrack on that, if for no other reason than now you have people in the House Intelligence Committee saying there is significant circumstantial evidence that COVID-19 outbreaks stem from a leak from the Wuhan Institute for Virology. Any comments about that before I let you go?
And Donald Trump was attacked for being a racist, suggesting that was the case. And in fact, it looks like we don't have any evidence that it did, but we don't have any evidence that it came from other places. And in fact, some of the other things like the wet markets and so forth, those seem to be largely dispelled now. So it is completely possible that it did come from the Virology Institute there in China, and we just don't know. But you can't dispel it because there's no evidence to do so.
Well, we're going to take a break, and Dr. Merrill Matthews, I'll let you get on to your busy life, but thank you for being willing to sit in the studio there in Dallas. Of course, we'll see each other face-to-face when I get back to Dallas next week, but we've been broadcasting today from Augusta, Georgia, the Good News Network, and just as I mentioned, we're going to get into a couple of other issues. I haven't even talked about what's going on in Israel, haven't talked about some of the woke corporations and what is happening right here in Georgia with Coca-Cola and a couple of others. A real push right now from the Supreme Court Commission to pack the Supreme Court, and a couple other good pieces coming from Peter Van Buren and Dennis Prager and a number of others. So we've got lots of great material that we will cover in the second hour. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us once again as we broadcast from Augusta, Georgia and the Good News Network. And this is an opportunity for you if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, of course, you'll find all sorts of material. But the second article has to do with this ceasefire in terms of what is happening in Israel. So I thought I would mention the fact that, indeed, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his security cabinet have agreed to what's called a unilateral ceasefire, and that has taken place. Now, this move came just really kind of a day after the argument by President Joe Biden that indeed there needed to be significant de-escalation. There was a sense in which earlier in the week, you might remember, President Joe Biden actually seemed to be supporting the nation of Israel. It's not like he's backed off from that, but after getting criticism from the squad, as they are called, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others, he then started calling for this idea of a ceasefire. So the Israeli government did announce an agreement to a truce at the moment, and we'll see where that leads us. But if nothing else, this came after about 2.5 hours of discussion. This is kind of an Egyptian-mediated proposal, and we'll see where it takes us there. But if nothing else, I thought it might be good for just a minute to explain how we got to this. A question we got this last hour was someone saying, why is it we're already talking about inflation? Where did that develop? And I think some of that developed during the Trump administration, but more certainly in the Biden administration. We may get to immigration, and that certainly has developed because of a change of policies there. But I think it's also fair to say that some of this has to do with a change in policy of the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration. But also just a little less than 2 weeks ago, we had two events that collided simultaneously that seemed to be the spark that set it off. And that is that you had a week ago last Sunday, what is called Jerusalem Day. Now, that is a national holiday in Israel, and it commemorates the reunification of Jerusalem. You know, when you had the Six-Day War in 1967, they were able to come and take over what is called the Old City. And so that was something that was being celebrated on that Sunday with prayer services at the Western Wall. Also, at the very same time, you have the Muslim Night of Power. Now, what is that? Well, that's a night, supposedly, when the first verse of the Quran was given to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. So Muslims were gathering at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Temple Mount. Jews were gathering at the Western Wall, and the Muslims started throwing rocks down on the Jews. The Israeli police then go into the Temple Mount and to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and find all sorts of rocks. And so there was all sorts of controversy that surfaced there. Meanwhile, there was another controversy. If you go to this neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, these buildings were actually owned by the Jewish people. Now, that goes all the way back 146 years ago, but when that land was seized by Jordan back in 1948, when there was an attempt to actually destroy this fledgling nation of Israel, then those areas were taken over by Arabs and what are called Palestinians in particular. And so when the Israeli army was able to liberate that area of Jerusalem back in 1967, back to that Six-Day War, the owners of these buildings who had owned the leases to those buildings reasserted their property rights. Well, they couldn't move the people out of those buildings, even though those land rights were registered with the Israeli Land Registry. And so finally, when the courts there in Jerusalem and in Israel ruled in favor, obviously, in front of those who had owned that land, they began to move some of those individuals out after a 48-year battle. And there was all sorts of controversy, still is controversy. And so in the midst of this, there was a lot going on, obviously, in Israel. But then add to it, as if we needed anything else, you have this militant Palestinian group called Hamas. Hamas, by the way, means zeal, and it's the idea of having zeal to ultimately destroy Israel. As a matter of fact, if you go, and I think it's still on the website, I've found it in other places, and look at the official charter of Hamas, you can find it in English, you will see that Hamas calls for the destruction of Israel in order to, quote, raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. So, of course, you've had these airstrikes, these rockets, thousands now of rockets being launched from Gaza into Israel. Most of them have been caught by the so-called Iron Dome, but still some have been able to get through. And we've reported here of the loss of life of some individuals we know that were kind of unofficial missionaries over there. Some of you that have listened to this program maybe have heard Paul Baraka. He represents one of these mission groups, and those mission groups indeed over there, they're not official missionary, but they're doing things so that they can certainly share the gospel with both Jew and Palestinian and others. Some of them have lost their lives, and of course there have been a loss of life certainly in Gaza, some from, of course, the retaliatory airstrikes from Israel, but I also have shown pictures of various rockets that didn't even make it out of Gaza and landed in Gaza and killed their fellow people. And, of course, one of the reasons it is so difficult for Israel to take out all of those rocket launching sites is because many of those rockets and many of the individuals that are terrorists actually are located in buildings which are, for example, hospitals, schools. In one case, it was a building which housed Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. And so you can see very quickly that it is difficult for them to, that is the Israeli IDF, to go in and take out some of those facilities, or if they do, to hear nothing but constant criticism from the press. And so if nothing else, one of the things we want to talk about here is what really has been taking place in Israel. And one other thing I might just mention before we go to a break is that in addition to all of this, another thing that is just unprecedented is the amount of street violence. We've had some of this before, but you've had Jewish extremists, I think sometimes because of the pandemic and the lockdown and just the sheer frustration, have been attacking Arabs. You, of course, have lots of Arab riots that have taken place in Jerusalem and a variety of other places, and Haifa. And so this is, I think, going to be an ongoing battle that we are going to address. But nevertheless, we do have very quickly evidence for a truce and a ceasefire. But when we come back from the break, let me just try to also answer the question that sometimes people raise, and that is, can't we solve this? I mean, can't we have a one-state solution? Can't we have a two-state solution? Can't we figure out how to actually bring peace to Israel? And I want you to understand at least some of the difficulty associated with that, and then we're going to move on to some of the other articles. But the second article we've posted today on the website, pointofview.net, tells you about the ceasefire, but some of the other material I wanted to cover just because it helps you have a background to what's been taking place in Israel. Pray for the peace of Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
3 scientific discoveries point to the existence of God. Dr. Stephen Meyer makes that claim in his book, Return of the God Hypothesis. A week ago, he was on my radio program to make the case for God. Arguments for the existence of God were compelling, but began to be challenged in the 19th century. For example, we had Darwin telling us where we came from. Marx, with a secular eschatology, was telling us where we were going, and Freud had an account of what to do with the human condition. By the end of the 19th century, you had this materialistic worldview that answered all the basic questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always answered. Meyer explains that there have been major cosmological and biological discoveries in the 20th century that are bringing back the features of the God hypothesis. The first significant discovery is that the physical universe had a beginning. Scientific materialists assumed that the material universe was eternal and thus self-existent. But now, most accept the fact that the universe began with an initial Big Bang. Second, physicists have discovered that we live in a Goldilocks universe. Scientists are finding fundamental physical laws and parameters of our universe that have been finely tuned against all odds to make our universe capable of hosting life. Third, discoveries in molecular biology have revealed the presence of a digital code at the foundation of life. This suggests a master programmer behind the genetic structure of DNA. The book also devotes an entire section to conjectures and refutations. Is there a rational response to the idea proposed by skeptics of multiple universes? What about Stephen Hawking and quantum cosmology? The God hypothesis is back in large part because of the remarkable advances in science in the last century. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212 at the Good News Network in Augusta, Georgia, and we'd love to hear from some of you. But one of the questions you may have in the back of your mind is, wait a minute. Okay, we've got all sorts of conflict in the Middle East, and can we bring about some kind of solution? So let me give you some basics, because there's a lot of misinformation, and I'm not trying to necessarily clear all of that up in just a short segment here. But if you want to understand Israel, you have a population in round numbers of about 9 million. 2 million Arabs, 7 million Jews that are actually in what is Israel. But then, in addition to that, you have about 2 million that live in Gaza, which is near, of course, the Mediterranean Sea, near Egypt. And that is an area that, of course, is very intense. And the ruler of Gaza, I've already mentioned, is Hamas. Then you also have another section which is called the West Bank. Why is it called the West Bank? Well, it's west of the Jordan River. About 2.7 million that live there, and that particular area is run by a different group called Fatah. Now, you might say, well, can't they work together? Well, first of all, there's no contiguous relationship between those two. And more importantly, as some people have said, it's kind of like red state, blue state. Hamas doesn't get along with Fatah or the Palestinian Authority and vice versa. So you might say, well, can't we just make it all one state? And that's the so-called one-state solution. Not many people talking about that, but I sometimes, if we've had a trip to Israel, have somebody say, can't we just bring them all together? Well, first of all, I think you can gather that Palestinian groups are not going to go for this. Is Hamas or Fatah going to go and be part of Israel? And the answer is no. But there's another reason why Israel is not interested in that either, because at that point, Arabs would then outnumber Jews. Now, remember, I just said a minute ago, you have 2 million Arabs and 7 million Jews. Well, it's important to recognize that those 2 million Arabs, they are represented in the Knesset. You know, for people to say, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and others say, that this is just an apartheid state, I thought it was interesting because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the other day said, well, you can't have a democracy in an apartheid government. And it's like, yep, that's right. You just made the case. This is a democracy. And if you're Arab, you actually have representation in the Knesset. If you look at some of the judges, they're Arab in Israel. And so, again, you would have that kind of representation. But first of all, there's no way you would have a one-state solution. So some people are saying, well, couldn't we have a two-state solution? Well, the problem with that is there really aren't natural borders in that particular case. If you ever have had a trip to Israel, you fly into Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, and as you head north, the first stop usually is in Caesarea. If you were to look to your left from your bus, it's about a mile to the ocean, the Mediterranean Ocean. If you look to your right, it's about 5 miles. In other words, at that point, there's only a country that's 6 miles wide. Can you imagine even trying to defend a country that's only 6 miles wide? Of course, would there be even a possibility of a two-state solution when one of the states actually is dedicated to the destruction of Israel? I think you can see that. There's no agreement about what you would do with the Temple Mount. Jerusalem would have to be obviously the capital of Israel. People don't like that. And there are just all sorts of reasons why trying to find a one-state solution, a two-state solution. I heard somebody the other day say a three-state solution, which just gets ridiculous. But nevertheless, you can see you just are sort of at a standstill, and each generation, each particular administration hopes to bring about something. I remember when George W. Bush had this roadmap to peace, and I've oftentimes said he should just take the roadmap to peace, fold it up, and put it in the glove compartment where other roadmaps belong, because it was not going to work. It simply cannot be functioning. But if you've been listening until now, you're saying, Kirby, you're left something out here. You're talking about Hamas. Of course, up in the north, there's Hezbollah. But all of this relates to a bigger country called Iran. And there's the other danger, because Iran has now been kind of motivated. You remember that there was an attempt to have the Iranian nuclear agreement that came under the Obama administration. You may remember that Donald Trump got rid of that. And so now there are various overtures from the Biden administration to go back to that. So that, in some respects, has caused Iran to want to exercise its, if you will, muscle. But it's also dealing with something else. Iran has wanted to expand its Shiite crescent, and they're concerned about the Saudis. To understand that, you have to recognize that most Muslims are Sunni. Egyptians, Turks, others are Sunnis, but those in Iran and also partly in the southern part of Iraq are Shiite. And so in some respects, they have always had difficulty trying to get all of the Muslim world to unite around their desire to expand what they were doing. So if nothing else, they have also been a little bit threatened, because you might remember under the previous administration, Donald Trump was able to actually put together various peace accords. Those were called the Abraham Accords. And so there was a peace accord between Israel and Bahrain, a peace accord between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. I think if Donald Trump had had a second term, he might have even actually been able to broker that. And so now the Iranian leaders are facing the fact that a lot of these Muslim nations, at least for the moment, actually have some kind of peace accord with Israel. So there are many people thinking that the idea behind this is that Gaza, with the Hamas, in a sense, a puppet of Iran, if it could intimidate Israel or get Israel to attack Gaza, then the Iranians could argue that Israel is actually attacking all Muslims. And so then if you go and read in the Quran, I wouldn't recommend it for your daily quiet time, but if you read the Quran in Surah 2, verse 190, it actually gives permission for Muslims to defend other Muslim countries or other Muslims from an attack. This could be using to unite all of the Muslim world against Israel. And as one of our guests on the program 2 weeks ago pointed out, you have to look at the map sometime and understand that when you look at Israel, it's sort of like putting a postage stamp in the midst of a football field. That's how small it is. And if indeed those Muslim countries would go after Israel, we would again hopefully see some kind of success like the 1967 Six-Day War or the 1973, but you're not sure. The other factor in this is, will Iran get nuclear weapons? And this is another great concern. And we talked about this on the program before, but I think it's worth mentioning again because you have certain individuals in Iran that have a very unique kind of Shiite belief. They're looking for this future Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I. They're expecting the Mahdi to come during a time of conflict. Now, the former president of Iran, that would be Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has actually been telling the Iranian people that even if they fire a nuclear weapon, which we assume they don't have but may have soon, a nuclear weapon against Israel, even if Israel retaliates, the Mahdi will protect them. Now, whether they believe that or not is almost incidental, but I think it illustrates, if nothing else, that we are dealing with something very different. If any of you are older, you might remember that during the Cold War, we had a thing called mutually assured destruction. That meant that if you had a nuclear weapon that was launched from the Soviet Union against the United States would retaliate. And I think the Russians were convinced that Ronald Reagan is just one of those wild cowboys who would actually do that. And so that was deterrence. But you can see how deterrence doesn't work very well if you've convinced yourself that you have a religious leader, kind of like a Christ or an Antichrist coming back to protect you. This is, I think, the great challenge that we face today in the Middle East. So if nothing else, as we come to our break, let me encourage you, first of all, to be in prayer. I think we should pray for those in authority. 1 Timothy 2, 1-2 tells us that we should pray for those in authority. Pray for this administration, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, secretary of defense. I mentioned just a minute ago we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem, Psalm 122, verse 6. I think we should also pray for the Jews and the Muslims, if nothing else, to turn to Jesus as their Messiah, because we're seeing an unprecedented number of Jews and especially Muslims coming to faith in Jesus. And so pretty encouraging kinds of things taking place. And if nothing else, one other thing, we have written a booklet at Point of View on anti-Semitism. I think we should really stand against anti-Semitism, which is being articulated not only sometimes out in the popular culture, but sometimes even by members of Congress. But we come back from the break, we've got a couple other articles we need to cover, and we will take the time to deal with those. But of course, if you have any thoughts or comments about Israel and the Middle East, we would certainly welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Broadcasting today from Augusta, Georgia on the Good News Network. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Broadcasting from Augusta, Georgia today at the Good News Network. And I thought for just a few minutes we would talk about state legislatures. Now, again, this is a national radio program, so I don't have a chance to talk about that too often. But I think we've already discovered that as some of these legislatures have decided that they wanted to try to improve voter integrity, that has become controversial. So I want to address that for just a minute. Also, one of the other requirements of every state legislature in the country is to redraw the various districts, because every 10 years we have a census, and then it's important to redraw those districts. And as a result, there's a lot of criticism coming out right now saying, well, these various legislatures are drawing these districts and they're gerrymandering them. Now, you didn't hear about that so much when Democrats were doing that, but now that you have a very significant number of states with Republican governors and Republican legislatures, you're hearing from Eric Holder and former President Barack Obama, so I want to address that as well. Of course, one of the other requirements of every state legislature is to come up with a balanced budget. Don't you wish the federal government did that? So we'll leave that one aside. But let's talk about one of the issues, and that is there has been, of course, a real desire on the part of various states to do something to clear up some of the ambiguity of the voting laws, or to recognize that what might have been allowed during a pandemic shouldn't happen in the future. And so as soon as, whether it's been the state of Georgia, the state of Texas, or a variety of other places, begin to pass legislation, you've had, of course, the CEOs weighing in. Since I'm broadcasting from Georgia today, we've got to talk about Coca-Cola and Delta and a few like that. Or, of course, in Texas, it's American Airlines, and a number of other places it's been Nike. And so we posted, I think yesterday, this article that was an op-ed, or actually an editorial, I should say, by the Wall Street Journal, The Price of Woke Politics, in which they were pointing out at the time that because some of these organizations, some of these CEOs and some of these corporations were taking on the state legislatures, they said, well, fair's game then. If you're going to get involved in the political process, we'll treat you like a political opponent. And a group called Consumer Research has put together these 30-second spots, and some of you may have seen some of those, especially since they've oftentimes run those spots in a place where the headquarters of, say, Coca-Cola, Delta, American Airlines might be. And I thought it was interesting because they, for example, of Nike said that rather than hiring Americans, Nike chose China. For, of course, American Airlines, they said, you know, here you've got somebody who got a $10 million budget, and yet here's an airline that is being best known for losing baggage. They lost ours the other day, by the way. Shrinking legroom and pandemic, and attacking Texas voter ID laws. And, of course, there have been some others like that. And so an article we didn't post today, but you can find it very easily, comes from our friend John Fund. John Fund used to be with the Wall Street Journal, now with National Review. It's called Woke Values Boomerang on Coca-Cola. And what he reminds us of is something we've seen before. The most recent Pew survey shows that about 37% of Americans nationwide say they feel less likely to buy Coca-Cola just because of some of the things said by the CEO. I'll let you decide if you indeed want to make that choice or not. But nevertheless, these kinds of arguments are surfacing. And what is so intriguing is not only have some of these woke politicians and these woke CEOs been criticized by the right, they're now being criticized by the left because once Coca-Cola kind of got into the crosshairs, now you have all sorts of liberals that John Fund's pointing out that are criticizing Coca-Cola because they pledged to use more recycled materials and a number of other things. So sometimes when you are simply doing your job, you don't kind of create a national conversation. But when all of a sudden you start speaking out on these issues, then people start saying, you know, if I can be a little bit more honest, some of the products you're producing come from people in prison, people in forced labor, and so this has probably not been exactly the best time for some of our woke CEOs. And, of course, the phrase I use so often, and I'm seeing it and hearing it more and more, go woke, go broke, because indeed we are seeing that with other companies and corporations. So that's one of the controversies that surfaced in the legislature, but I wanted to focus on another article that we've posted called Gerrymanders and Double Standards. It's written by Karl Rove. You won't hear me quoting Karl Rove too often, but I think it was a pretty good piece here in which he reminds us that you've had what you call this National Democratic Redistricting Committee. It was formed by the former Attorney General Eric Holder and President Barack Obama. And they have been very critical of extreme partisan gerrymandering. Now, what's gerrymandering? Well, that was created from a man that actually redrew a district up in Massachusetts. And, of course, we recognize that there indeed are always cases in which you have individuals who are of one party or the other want to do what they can to actually deal as much as possible with something that would give an advantage to the party. Well, in this piece that we've posted here, it reminds us that the gerrymandering sometimes is going the other direction. For example, he says, let's look at the state of Illinois. We broadcast in Illinois. They are actually losing a congressional seat. And so you would expect that since they're losing a congressional seat, and since if you look at the various congressional races in the past, Republicans won at least 41% of the votes in Illinois during the 2020 congressional races. But if you look at what the Democratic legislature is doing in Illinois, it looks like they will only hold 28% of those seats. So if you're looking for a good example of partisan gerrymandering, all you have to do is look in the state of Illinois. Here's another one that Karl Rove mentions. If you look at New York, same thing. The Census Bureau finally decided, looking at this, there was a debate as to whether or not New York would lose a seat or not. It is going to lose one of its seats. They're going to go from 26 seats to 27 congressional seats. By the way, you see almost all of these places where the seats have been lost. Most of them have been in blue states, few exceptions, but most of them have been. And in most cases, places, states that gain seats usually are red states. Oregon is one of the few exceptions, but most of them tend to be like Texas or Florida, a variety of other places. But nevertheless, if you look at New York, again, you can see that the Democratic legislature there, if nothing else, is redrawing the districts in a way that once again give tremendous benefit to the Democrats. And even though you have Republicans that have, in many cases, won in various congressional districts, nothing of the case. One last one I thought I'd just mention real quickly, according to Karl Rove, is in the state of Maryland. Right now, it has 2 Republicans and 6 Democratic representatives. Democrats have added half of the 6 voters in a district near the District of Columbia. But again, you see the same kind of shenanigans that take place. And, of course, gerrymandering has always been the case for some time, and that is there is always an attempt to try to gain at least a little bit of benefit. But even when that gerrymandering takes place and they draw some of these really bizarre congressional districts, it also, even if it is helping Republicans, it is also helping Democrats, and in most cases it's drawn in such a way to help an incumbent so that in some respects there aren't as many congressional districts where the race is really competitive. There was an estimate a number of years ago that the re-election of various members of Congress is on the same order of the re-election of the Politburo in the Soviet Union. And so in some respects, we jokingly sometimes say that in the Senate, the people in the state choose their senators, but in Congress and the House of Representatives, Congress chooses their voters. And so that is just another one of those ongoing battles that we've talked about before. We don't focus too much on the legislature, but I would encourage you to find out what is happening in your legislature right now, because they need to balance the budget. They really need to redraw those congressional districts and educational districts and state representative districts and all of the rest. And then I hope that some of them are also addressing some of these issues of voter integrity. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to pick out just a couple more issues real quickly. There are lots of things to cover, and of course, we certainly appreciate those of you that have been listening. But if you, before we run out of time today, have a comment or a question about anything we've covered here on Point of View, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to read this in its entirety, you can simply go to pointofview.net. And as you go there, you'll see each one of the articles. If you'd like to listen to this again, of course, you can download the podcast. And my commentary today, of course, addresses all sorts of very important issues, including the God hypothesis. We'll talk about that right after this.
In a study of 10th and 12th graders conducted during peak COVID-19 school lockdown months, fewer respondents reported feeling depressed than in a study conducted 2 years earlier. The study's lead author, academic psychologist Jean Twenge, says spending more time with their families was good for these teenagers' mental health. The baseline for Gen Z happiness is low. Their extensive social media use and often minimal in-person social interaction makes healthy family life crucial for them. Yet there are powerful societal forces threatening to mitigate the influence of the nuclear family. Countless studies and simple common sense tell us that a child fares best when raised by a married mom and dad. Even organizations one could describe as woke admit that kids with married parents do best. To them, the nuclear family is an oppressor precisely because it provides these good outcomes. The Colson Center's John Stonestreet and Maria Baer point to Black Lives Matter's prior statements of their intention to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement. Mr. Stonestreet's Breakpoint commentary identifies scholars who acknowledge the benefits but maintain that nuclear families disadvantage other family arrangements, an example of privilege rooted in white supremacy. In a recent sermon, Pastor John MacArthur told the congregation at Grace Community Church and his radio audience, this culture is weaponized to destroy children. It's systematically designed to do that. He lamented the millions of babies slaughtered in the womb. He then critiqued public education, where children come under the influence of those whose agenda is anti-God, anti-Christ, and anti-Scripture. Politicians, he said, are making laws that are devastating to children under the pressure of sexual freedom, homosexuality, transgenderism, and banning hate speech to punish people who speak against these things. The current universal government daycare proposal, with its stated goal to get mothers into the workforce, is not a solution to the weakening of the American family. We must summon the courage to uphold God's good design for the family. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that we're going to focus on science now. We've been moving all over the map in terms of topics, but if nothing else, thought this would be somewhat of an encouragement to you. And my commentary today is based on the interview that we did recently with Dr. Stephen Meyer on the return of the God hypothesis. I've known Dr. Stephen Meyer for almost 40 years when I started thinking about that. Matter of fact, his wife at one point taught my daughter at Schofield Christian School. So we've known each other for a long time. I knew him even before he went to Cambridge University and got his doctorate. But anyway, his book, Return of the God Hypothesis, is the kind of book that if you have a non-Christian friend, family, neighbor who doesn't really believe in God and yet has a real scientific background, this would be a real challenge of the book, because what he does is recognize that in the, say, 17th and 18th century, there were very good arguments for the existence of God, and then most of those got challenged in the basically 19th century, starting first with Charles Darwin, who kind of told us where we were coming from. Karl Marx, who gave us kind of a secular eschatology, telling us where we were going, and then Sigmund Freud giving an account of the human condition. And so really by the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, there was a real emphasis on humanism and those kinds of ideas. And there was a belief, kind of a belief among a lot of scientists that were atheists that, okay, we've got it all explained now. And then, surprisingly, things went in a different direction, because he points out three very compelling arguments or scientific discoveries that really, I think, are a very profound argument for the existence of God. Now, we know more about who God is and his character by reading the Bible, but even a person who has not read the Bible, looking at some of these facts, have got to say, this looks a little bit more like there is a universe that has a God behind it than I would have imagined before. The first is, of course, as we've mentioned, that the physical universe had a beginning. Whether it's a big bang or not, their argument always before from the evolutionist and the atheist was, well, if the universe is eternal, we don't have to explain where it came from because it always existed. But once you say it had a beginning, and that beginning came in a very unusual way, because they're now arguing that not only space and time were created, whatever brought it into being has to be outside of time. That sounds eternal. Outside of space, omnipresent. So that's kind of interesting. The second argument is that we also have recognized this fine-tuning of the universe, which is oftentimes referred to as a Goldilocks universe. You know, remember Goldilocks and the Three Bears? One's too hot, one's too cold, one is just right. And the same thing, we see that these fundamental laws and these parameters are finely tuned, and he went into some detail, not only in his book, but even in our interview the other day, in how very finely tuned these are, and those are very powerful arguments as well. And then finally, he points out that when we look at the molecular biology, so whether we look in our telescopes in the far dimension of space, or if we look in the microscopes in the small dimensions of space, we see now that there is a digital code. And it's a digital code that is really very specific. And he even quoted one of the individuals there, Bill Gates, who said this code is more specific and more intricate than any code we've ever written at Microsoft. And so again, this idea of a code suggests a code giver, program suggests a master programmer behind the genetic structure. And then if you have ever run into an atheist, sometimes they say, well, yeah, but what about, I don't know, maybe multiple universes? Well, he has a whole section on that. What about, Stephen Hawking and his idea of quantum cosmology? Well, he has that as well. You may not even understand one or two of those chapters, but it's just the kind of book that I would want you to think about getting a copy of and passing on to some of those skeptical, science-based atheist friends of yours. And so if nothing else, I just thought that I might spend a moment mentioning that. And my brief summary of that book is one of the commentaries. Matter of fact, it is the commentary for today, which you can find at pointofview.net. One of the other intriguing things in science is that as we are starting to collect more data, you're starting to have more and more individuals who would not be predisposed to challenge the idea of the climate discussion of global warming and climate change are doing so. And we've talked about Bjorn Lomborg, and we've interviewed some of these individuals that were very well-known environmentalists who have changed their mind. But one that is also causing a great deal of indigestion, I would say, for some of the people promoting climate change is Dr. Stephen Koonin. You might say, well, who is he? Well, he worked for President Barack Obama. He was one of the top physicists for Barack Obama. He's a Democrat, but he was the Undersecretary of Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. He's published a book, and I've ordered a copy of it, and we'll maybe try to do a discussion of it. I'll see whether or not he would be good enough to bring on to do an interview, but the book is entitled Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us and What It Doesn't and Why It Matters. This is an individual that is getting a fair amount of criticism, as you might imagine, because the Wall Street Journal the other day put it this way. He said, Dr. Coonan is no climate denier, to use the concocted phrase used to shut down debate. The word denier, of course, is meant to associate skeptics of climate alarmism with the Holocaust deniers. But they said that as for denying, Dr. Coonan makes it clear on the book's first page that it's true that the globe may be warming a little bit and humans might have some influence, but he is, like so many now, coming forward just appalled at all the statements being made by a lot of these climate activists. So if nothing else, of course, he's had some real difficulties getting his views across. I'm not sure he's going to show up on ABC, NBC, CNBC, or anything else. But the piece that I've posted here for you to read reminds you that sometimes you have not even heard about him because Facebook, you might notice, they have what are called fact checkers. And so the fact checkers recently tried to keep him off for a number of reasons. And this is by Katie Pavlich that points out that as they were even writing about that in Town Hall, they actually said Town Hall was guilty of misinformation. They said that the Town Hall article repeats several misleading and false claims regarding climate change that appear in Stephen Coonan's book Unsettled. Science Feedback, which is the fact checker there, said in response to our appeal, the Town Hall article doesn't provide any indication or additional context to readers that explains these claims are inconsistent with the current scientific evidence. And they went back and, if nothing else, pointed out, said, look, we didn't endorse it. We just simply said this is what he's saying. And just quoting what is said in this article from what is in this book by an individual that worked for the Obama administration in the U.S. Department as the Undersecretary for Science is enough to sometimes get you labeled by the fact checkers. So if nothing else, I think we find ourselves so often having to deal with individuals that don't want to have an honest, robust debate. But if nothing else, I just wanted you to know that you may not have even heard of this individual. I'm going to get a copy of his book. Maybe you want to as well, because here's an individual that worked in the Obama administration that's saying, you know what, the science isn't that settled. And that's why the title of the book is Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. And why does it matter? Because it's going to affect you and your family in terms of energy use and much, much more. Well, again, I want to thank everybody that's been a part of this broadcast today. Certainly want to thank Andrew and Stephen, and also for Warren, who's been here with me as we've been doing our live broadcast from Augusta, Georgia. Look forward to seeing you back here on Point of View on Monday. Look forward to having a great weekend. We'll see you back then.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.